Welcome to Grant's Rock Warehouse, and today I have a special guest. Not only do we have Todd Evans here, but we've got Scott Byron, who is the A&R rep for Matthew Sweet. This is the gentleman that brought Matthew Sweet to Zoo. So stay tuned. So welcome to Grant's Rock Warehouse. I want to welcome Todd Evans, my co-host, and I'm welcoming Scott Byron, who is the A&R rep for Zoo Entertainment. Welcome, gentlemen. How is everybody tonight?
Good, thank you.
Happy to do this.
This is great. Now, as if anyone's been following our Matthew Sweet series, we've been going through the records, doing a review. So, but now we're postponing the next episode so we can talk to Scott, because like I said, Scott was an A&R rep for Zoo. Scott is the gentleman who brought Matthew Sweet to Zoo. So Scott, let's go into a little bit like your history to some degree, because in 1990, Zoo was a new label, right?
Yeah, I was one of the very first people who worked for Zoo when it first started. It was run by a guy named Lou Malia, who had been the president of Island Records for a long time. And before Zoo, I worked for a magazine called CMJ. Are you guys familiar?
Yeah, I remember CMJ.
Yes.
Yeah, I was the editor of the trade magazine, the one that did the college radio charts and reviewed all the records for college radio. And I worked there for about 8 years after I graduated college. And during that time, at one point, I met Lou Malia, and he actually offered me a job at a Island Records subsidiary. And after talking to a few people, I decided not to take the job at the time. They thought it was a bad fit for me, and turns out that they were right. But then Lou left Island and started Zoo Entertainment right around the same time that I decided to leave CMJ. That was my decision. I just had enough of the publishing schedule, which was driving me a bit bananas. And I took a few months off, and then I heard that Lou had started this label, and I called him up, and he immediately hired me on the phone. He just, and I was the first thing. The day after he hired me, he put me on a plane to somewhere in Canada to see a band that some lawyer wanted him to see. It was my introduction to A&R. But Lou, it was in New York at the time, but he knew that this was going to be a West Coast label within BMG. This was an interesting time in the music business, and this is relevant to the Matthew Sweet story. But it was a time when CDs had been introduced, and the record companies were all reselling all of their catalog on CD, and they had money just coming in like crazy. And for the first time in many years, they were using this to invest in new talent. So they hired Lou away, BMG hired Lou away and said, go find new artists. And he opened up an LA office, but I was his New York A&R person for the label. And it took a while for the label to get going, and I was listening to stuff. And after I took the job, first of all, just going back, when I was at CMJ, I heard Inside and Earth, and we may have even reviewed them, but to be perfectly blunt, I kind of hated them. I really did not like Matthew Sweet. He was just one of those people that I heard, I recognized he might be able to write a song, but I really didn't like the records. So shortly after I took this job, I got calls from a few friends. And because I was at CMJ, I knew a lot of people who worked for record companies. I dealt with them every single day, all the record companies. And I got a call from a guy who worked for A&M named Michael Crumper, who was in the publicity department, telling me about this record that they had that they were not going to release. And my response was to shrug. I don't like Matthew Sweet. Why do I care about this? So I just basically ignored him. And I also heard from a woman named Karen Glauber, who had worked for A&M, who is now working for Hits magazine, and who is one of the most important people in the alternative music world, which I guess I was as well. And she told me about this record too and said it was really good. And again, I shrugged it off. I didn't even ask for a copy. I just kind of went about my life, and that was that. And a few months later, around this time, my father was ill, very seriously ill. He ended up passing away a year or two later. But New Year's Eve came around, and I decided that I was going to spend New Year's Eve in the hospital with him and my mother. And they came around at 10 o'clock at night and told us, sorry, we're only allowing one visitor to stay past visiting hours for New Year's Eve. And of course, that was my mother. So I left. I walked out on New Year's Eve at 10 o'clock, and I had nothing to do. So I took out my little date book, which I carried in my back pocket. This was before, cell phones and that sort of thing. And I looked up who was playing that night, and Lloyd Cole was playing. And he was playing at CBGB's. It was actually a Lloyd Cole / Matthew Sweet co-headline show. But I didn't even bother writing Matthew Sweet's name in my date book because I didn't care about him. But I did like Lloyd Cole. So, and CBGB's was really nice to A&R people. They would just wave you in. You didn't have to have a ticket. So I went down to CBGB's to see Lloyd Cole. And it was a co-headline show where they were doing cover versions and originals. Matthew was doing Beatles songs and Lloyd Cole was doing Rolling Stones songs. And they would alternate. He would do a Beatles song and an original, and Lloyd Cole would do a Stones song and an original. And this went on for an hour or two, and it was really amazing. And Matthew's songs sounded great. So I went back after the show and I gave him my business card. And I said, I heard you have a record, and I'd like to hear it. And we talked very briefly, but like I said, I still wasn't a fan, but I wanted to hear the record. And about 2 months later, the tape showed up from his manager, Russell Carter. Which, as an aside, in one of your shows, you wondered what RCAM Records was. Mm-hmm. That stands for Russell Carter Artist Management. It was basically a self-release, some of the later stuff. But I got the tape, and obviously I liked it. But before I go on with how it ended up coming to Zoo, let's go back to why it didn't come out on A&M, because I know you guys care about that.
Yeah.
Well, we're very fascinated with that whole era,
All right. The A&R person who signed Matthew to Columbia was named Steve Ralbovsky. And he's listed as the executive producer of Inside, and I think he's listed as the A&R person for Earth. But he was the guy who liked Matthew's demos. Matthew had met Michael Stipe and Michael in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they had corresponded mostly by postcard. And Michael had encouraged him to come to Georgia, and he went to school there. Todd, you went there. I remember.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So and he was in that scene, but Matthew was a little bit of a contrarian, and everybody in that scene was all about being organic. You had to do everything organically. You had to make your own records. You had to go out and tour. You had to build your base really slowly. But Matthew was much more ambitious, and he liked drum machines. He liked making his own demos at home using drum machines. And everybody in Georgia, they didn't care for that very much. But he sent his tapes to Ralbovsky, and Ralbovsky liked it and brought him to New York and signed him to a deal. Matthew moved up to, he was living in Princeton, New Jersey. And he made his records with Steve. And then Steve left Columbia and moved to A&M and took Matthew with him. And that's why he's Inside didn't do very well. So that's why Earth ended up coming out on A&M, was because Steve was his biggest fan. And that's one of the things that people don't always understand about A&R is it's not just about, this is a good record. It's about, am I going to be able to champion this record and make it happen at this company that I'm working at? Now, in a company like Columbia and a company like A&M, they are really large labels that have all sorts of different departments and people, and they can deal with almost anything. But Zoo, you had to be a little bit more careful. Now, Steve made this record, and Steve was the A&R person behind the making of Girlfriend. But the key thing that happened during this time was that, and Girlfriend was being made for A&M Records, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And the key thing that happened here that you guys didn't bring up was that during the recording of the record, A&M Records was sold to Polygram. The whole record
remember
company.
that.
It was a really big moment. I don't know if you've seen the special on, I think it's on Showtime, called Mr. A and Mr. M. It's basically a history. You got to check it out. It's a history of A&M Records, which was one of the best places to be as an artist. And A&M would have killed it with Girlfriend if they hadn't been sold to Polygram.
Okay, there you go.
And that's the key moment. And I don't know if he was fired or if he left, but Steve left A&M as well, Steve Ralbowski. Now, I had never met Steve. I ended up meeting him, 10 years later, like after we both were away from Matthew's history. I met him backstage at a Matthew Sweet show years later. But Steve left the label. So the Girlfriend album no longer had a champion at the label. A&M owns the record, but nobody was advocating for the record, and Polygram couldn't give a damn about Matthew Sweet. And they now had the record. A&M was being absorbed in, and people were leaving. Karen left and Michael left, all these people that cared about Matthew. Steve was no longer there. So the record was left in limbo, and nobody wanted to put it out at Polygram or even at the remnants of A&M. So it was just kind of sitting there. Everybody who heard it knew it was a good record, but without somebody championing it, it just wasn't going to come out. Now, Russell was not Matthew's manager on Inside and Earth. I think he was Matthew's lawyer, but he ended up taking over management for Matthew, and he was the person who was shopping it around. You've heard that it got shopped to all different labels, and everybody rejected it. It really did not sound like anything that was on alternative radio at the time. It was so dry, and nobody was making dry records at that time. Everything was, reverb and drum machines like Matthew had done before. Doing it with real drums and real musicians. It was it had no place again, and just like Matthew had no place before when he was doing, Inside and Earth. But I heard the record, and I immediately heard that it was a Beatles type of record. And I thought that we could make a go of this. And I brought it to my boss in A&R. He didn't quite get it. This was a guy who I didn't get along with very well in the department. But there was another A&R person named Bud Scapa, who is a pretty well-known author. He wrote for Rolling Stone. He wrote books. He had done A&R for Arista. He was the West Coast A&R person, and he got it too. I sent him Girlfriend, and he got it too. So he became my advocate within the office, the main office, which had now started up in Los Angeles. And we would have these A&R conference calls, and I would bring up, I think we should sign Matthew Sweet. And this head of A&R, whose name is completely gone from my head, he just didn't get it. And I remember on one of these calls actually blurting out, "It's a fucking Beatles record." And this guy going, "Don't even start comparing it to the Beatles." He didn't hear that at all. It was completely alien to him. And I had to back off, like, okay, I get it. You don't hear the comparison. But thankfully, about a month or two later, he was fired. So Bud took over the A&R department, and he wanted to release the record too. So now we had to go and convince Lou Malia that he should, release this record as well. And he initially agreed. And, things started to move along, and they started to negotiate with A&M Records to purchase the master. And then somebody at the company who had worked for A&M before, she was the woman who was in charge of sales. Her name was Jane Simon. She actually called a contact at A&M and found out how many copies Earth had sold. And even though we were in the middle of negotiations, Lou, I don't remember the exact number. It was something ridiculous, like it shipped 50,000 and returned 40,000 or something like that. So the numbers were really tiny. And Lou heard this and he pulled the plug. And I had to call Matthew. I had met up with Matthew and told him I was going to try to do this. We had lunch at a place in a place called the NoHo Star in Greenwich Village. And we got along very well. I even went out and visited him at his house in Princeton, which had a drum kit set up in the living room where he would do his demos. But they pulled the plug, and I had to call Matthew and say, sorry, it's not going to happen. And Bud decided that he would give it one more try. And this story has been reported somewhere, but he showed up early for work one day and sat in his office, and he decided that he was going to write a review of Girlfriend as if he was reviewing it for Rolling Stone magazine. He was going to typeset it like Rolling Stone. And he was going to, present this to Lou to try to get him to understand it. And so he was blasting the record on, well beyond 10, 11 or 12 in his office, nobody else in the office. And then Lou showed up for work, as he usually does early. And he walked into the office and he said, Lou was a very salty guy. He said to Bud, "What the fuck is this?" And Bud said, it's Matthew Sweet. And he goes, "What's going on with that?" And he goes, "Well, you passed on it a few weeks ago." And he went, and he went back to his office and he listened to the record again and he changed his mind and he called me up and said, "Okay, we're going to do it." And we ended up cutting it because of the sales totals from A&M. We ended up cutting a deal which was pretty favorable. I think that A&M was in for $150,000 making the record. I'm not sure of the numbers, but we cut a deal where we would pay 1/3 of that up front and 1/3 of it if it sold a certain amount of copies, and the last third if it sold more copies. So our exposure up front was pretty small. And, $50,000 to make a record for a major label was nothing. Oh, I want to go back a little bit here too, because you guys talked about a little bit about the recording of the record. I found out a lot about this stuff later on. It was recorded at a place in New York called Axis Studios. And eventually, at some point, I got to visit Axis. And it's nothing like you probably picture it in your head. You probably picture a bunch of musicians sitting in a small room, kind of staring at each other, recording it. But it turns out Axis is a board in a very small room and one little tiny recording room that can hold one person.
It's that small. Holy crap.
I mean, it's teeny. And there might be a lounge or something for the musicians to hang out, but that's it. There was a recording board and a little tiny room, and everything was done in that little tiny room. When Robert Quine showed up, he recorded in that room. And when when Rick Menk showed up, he would record in that little room. And Matthew did his vocals in that same little room. And I was astounded when I saw it because it felt so big to me when I heard
it
the record.
Sounds big. Yeah.
And the key person who Fred Marr is a great producer, but the key person who you guys didn't really talk about at all was the engineer on the record, a guy named Jim Rondinelli. And Jim is probably as responsible as anybody for the dry sound of the record. And one of the things I learned later about Jim was that he worked for a long time with Prince. He worked at Paisley Park Studios for Prince, mixing. You know, we know that Prince recorded a bazillion things at his studio.
Right.
Well, Jim was one of the people who would sit there and mix it down, and then it would go in the vault, or Prince would decide to release it or whatever. But he did probably hundreds, maybe thousands of records for Prince. And one of the things he once told me about Prince was that, and I think this informs the way that Girlfriend was recorded, was that one of the things that Prince used to do was record a hell of a lot of stuff. You know, many guitar parts, many string parts, many keyboard parts, many drum parts, everything. And then he would sit with his mixing people and they would take stuff out until there was the absolute minimum left to have the essence of the song that Prince had in his head. And it was all there on the 64 tracks or whatever, but the objective was to have the minimum left to make it what it was. And if you listen to a song like Kiss, there's almost nothing there. I don't think Jim mixed that song. You'd have to ask him. But there's almost nothing there. And I'm sure there is like a 64 track multi there, but they got it down to a drum part and a bass part and a vocal and a guitar solo. And that's pretty much the whole song. And the thing about Girlfriend is that it's very minimalistic that way. There's no bells and whistles. There's no effects on it. It just, Jim, I think as much as anybody is responsible for that part of the sound.
At what point did the title of it change from Nothing Lasts to Girlfriend? Like when Zoo got a hold of it, was it already Girlfriend? All
right, so yeah, I'm glad you reminded me of that. One of the things that happened while Matthew was during that time when, one of the things about Girlfriend, I mean, you talked about it being a breakup record, but it's not just a breakup record. It's both a breakup record of his first marriage and meeting the woman who would eventually become his wife. And that's why, a song like I've Been Waiting is a song about his second wife, not his first wife, and Divine Intervention, where he's, is a breakup song. That's about his first wife. It's all about all the different things that are happening at that point. You Don't Love Me, and things like that about the first wife. But during the time when he was courting or engaged to Lisa, his second wife, who was a wonderful, wonderful girl, they would go from Princeton into Manhattan and spend a lot of time at a photo library. And they would actually volunteer there sorting photos. There would be these huge drawers full of 5x7 photos, and they want to make sure that everything was, all the pictures of this person or that person were together. And Matthew became enamored. Matthew had always had a thing for female movie stars. That's, even though Winona was named after Winona Ryder, it's generally just a song about liking movie stars.
Right.
It was renamed later. That happened before my time as well. But he became enamored of all these pictures of Tuesday Weld, who, by the way, in those photos is 14 years old. It's mind-blowing when you look at her.
Kind of. She looks older than that.
Well, the thing that Matthew loved about these photos is that she's in the Hollywood Hills. She's 14 years old, and she looks like she knows the world. And that's what appealed to him about the song. I mean, he thought it embodied that attitude that he was going for at that time. There's another picture of her in the package where she's just kind of standing in the hills as well. And she was already a star at that point. When she was a kid, she did Dobie Gillis and all sorts of stuff like that. But he wanted this picture for the cover. I was all in on it. The art department was all in on it. And we needed to get permission. So, we sent a copy of the record and the photo we wanted to use. It was done by the lawyers. It was not done by me. Exactly.
There you go.
14. The lawyers took care of it, but they sent it off to, they found out who her publicist was, and they actually liked the record and gave approval. And at the very end of the negotiation, they said, oh, by the way, they wanted to make sure there was, excuse me, there wasn't a problem with it. So they said, oh, by the way, the title of the album is Nothing Lasts. And they came back the next day and said, we don't like that. And so I went to Matthew and I said, she won't give approval if the title of the album is Nothing Lasts. And it was really not a big deal to Matthew. He just said, then let's call it Girlfriends. And I said, I love that. And we went back and said, are you okay with calling the album Girlfriend? And the publicist said yes, and that was that.
Simple and easy.
Yeah. So the art department went, oh, that's the other picture.
There's the other photo, by the way.
Yep. And I think there's a color version of it in one of the packages too. But anyway, it's a good photo. I have my CDs here too, but I don't remember where that color photo is. But those were pictures that Matthew and Lisa took from that was their payment for volunteering there, was they got to take a handful of pictures each time they were there. They'd work a few hours, and that's where they got the pictures, was at some photo archive
cool.
that they worked at in New York. Yeah. Did you have another question, Todd?
I do, but I wanted to give Grant, do you have one?
Well, I've got a whole bunch.
Well, I mean, I'm just getting up to where we're putting together the
package. I only have one more question, and you may have been.
Go ahead, Todd, while I go through my notes.
But did Matthew decide to change direction all on his own, or did he have somebody pushing him that way?
Yeah, because
of the
if you
difference
think
between his
about it,
first two.
Yeah, you look at the first two records, which are very different from what Girlfriend is. I mean, Earth is kind of, there are certain tracks on there where you kind of see where things could move,
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm pretty sure it had to do with touring and just starting to become more and more comfortable with, with a live drum sound. And, he did tour Behind Earth. And I think when he was doing his demos, he just decided to try a live drum sound instead of using a drum machine. And in some cases, I think he used a drum machine early on, and then he brought Rick, Rick Menken to do that. All of Matthew's demos start with the drums. I mean, he may have built them up a little bit, but all of his official demos started with Rick doing a bunch of drum tracks that Matthew had in mind, and then he would build the tracks on top of them. And when he started using Rick to do his demos, that was how everything happened, really. I don't know if Russell, who is now managing him, had anything to do with it. I'm pretty sure that Russell didn't send him Neil Young records. I think what happened is that Matthew sent his demos to Russell, and Russell says, oh, they sound like Neil Young. And Matthew goes, who?
Yeah, what I read, he wasn't even familiar with Neil's work.
Right. And of course he completely fell in love with him. And we had a lot of conversations about Neil Young. And I knew a lot of, I was just a music fanatic. I mean, I knew a lot about Neil Young, but I did not have a copy of Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. And that's really the record that Matthew glommed onto as being his favorite Neil Young record around that time, and informed a lot of his, live arrangements and the way he recorded. There was one moment where, I said it's a finished record, except Jim had one thing he wanted to fix on the record, which we went to a studio in Manhattan. I don't remember what it was. Jim made all the arrangements, and he wanted to fix 1 second of the record before it went off for mastering. And Jim told me at one point that it was the only effect real effect that's on the record. It's the moment at the very, very start of You Don't Love Me where it kind of fades in. And that is, all he took was the first second of the recording and he electronically reversed it. That was the only change that was made from the record as it was on that first cassette that I got from Russell. Now, I'm sure someone's going to ask why there's the record noise.
I was just going to bring that up. Was that already there? What was that on the
Yeah.
master when you heard it?
Yeah, that was on the demos, on the advanced cassette or the original mix when I heard it. The record, when they were making the record, vinyl was still kind of predominant while they were recording it. But by the time they made it as an A-side, B-side album. But by the time it was time to finish it, nobody was releasing vinyl anymore.
Yeah, 91 was like the end date.
Yeah, it was. And it was actually frustrating to me when we put the record out because I wanted to do something on vinyl just for college radio. And we'll get to the marketing in a few moments. We're not there yet. But Lou refused to do vinyl. He told me flat out, nobody buys vinyl anymore. We're not releasing any vinyl on this label. That ended up changing a little later because the label had Tool and, they insisted. But there was no vinyl being released in 1991. And I had started at the label in 1990 and it was the end of 1990 when that New Year's Eve thing happened. And it was pretty much dead at that point. And the compromise I got was the Super Deformed EP, the 7-inch vinyl. That was the vinyl I got to give to college radio.